Hello, and welcome to Course 3 of Verifier Training for the Oregon GHG Reporting Program. In this course, we will be discussing verification for electricity suppliers. If you have any questions about this course, please email us at 3pvverify@deq.oregon.gov. As a short disclaimer, the information presented in these slides does not replace the verifier's responsibility to know and abide by DEQ's GHG reporting program and third-party verification regulations. Please read the regulations, and if any information conflicts, the regulation takes precedence. In this training, we will discuss the following topics as they relate to electricity supplier greenhouse gas reporting: a review of the GHG Electricity Supplier Reporting Program, who gets verified, what data electricity suppliers are required to report to the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, what data electricity suppliers input into our online reporting platform, Your DEQ Online, and how Your DEQ Online calculates emissions from this data, what documentation and elements are used to verify reported data, and finally, we will go over some exercises to better demonstrate how Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program rules are applied to specific situations. We'll begin today by sharing some background on how electricity suppliers fit into our GHG reporting program. The GHG reporting program collects emissions data associated with electricity used in Oregon. In other words, regardless of whether electricity was generated in Oregon or imported from another state, the emissions data collected are those associated with electricity consumed in Oregon. Emissions data are collected on an annual basis, and electricity suppliers report data from the previous calendar year. For example, data reported in 2024 are for emissions from January 1, 2023 to December 31st, 2023. To put emissions from electricity used in Oregon in context, this graph displays the relative proportion of emissions from electricity used in Oregon relative to other major sectors emitting anthropogenic emissions from 1990 to 2021. Time is displayed on the x-axis, and million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent are displayed on the y-axis. As you can see, emissions from the electricity used in Oregon is second only to the emissions from the transportation sector. In fact, electricity accounts for approximately 30% of Oregon's overall anthropogenic emissions. Here is another image to provide some context about the electricity sector in Oregon. This illustration shows the state-level resource mix for investor and consumer-owned utilities serving Oregon in 2021 for electricity used in Oregon. Most of the mix came from hydropower, coal, and natural gas. A smaller percentage of power in the region came from non-hydroelectric renewable sources such as wind, nuclear, and solar power. You can compare the previous image of what fuel is providing electricity used in Oregon to this image depicting the emissions from that resource mix, either from generation, contract, or market purchases. In 2021, coal was the primary producer of GHGs for electricity use in Oregon, followed by natural gas. Here is one final slide to contextualize Oregon's electricity sector. The data displayed is collected by the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. On the left, you will see how load, the blue line, varies with emissions, the red line, over time. On the right, you can see how emissions intensity, that is emissions per megawatt hour, has changed over time. This slide provides a list of the key regulatory provisions relevant to the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program electricity sector. The primary purpose of this slide is for your reference after this training. I do want to point out that the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program rules in Division 215 are in a separate division from the third-party verification rules in Division 272. Both are in Oregon Administrative Rules Chapter 340. Many of the rule sections listed here apply to multiple sectors that report to the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, including air contamination sources, fuel suppliers, natural gas suppliers, and electricity suppliers. All electricity suppliers that report to the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program must submit their emission data report by June 1st following the emissions calendar year, unless otherwise established by DEQ. After this date is when data will become available for you to verify. Beginning in 2022 for 2021 data, these electricity suppliers that are subject to verification must submit verification statements to DEQ no later than September 30th. OAR 340-215-30 provides guidance on which entities are subject to reporting. Electricity suppliers, including investor-owned utilities, multi-jurisdictional utilities, electricity service suppliers, consumer-owned utilities, and other persons that import, sell, allocate, or distribute electricity to end users in the state must submit emissions data reports. In 2023, there were 46 entities that provided electricity to end users in Oregon, including 3 investor-owned utilities, Portland General Electric, PacifiCorp, and Idaho Power, 4 electricity service suppliers, and 39 consumer-owned utilities, 15 of which reported directly to DEQ, and the remaining 24 designating a third party to report on their behalf. We will talk more about third-party reporting in a later slide. There are 2 additional types of entities that report under the electricity sector: multi-jurisdictional utilities and asset controlling suppliers. Any utility, investor-owned or consumer-owned, can be considered a multi-jurisdictional utility. Multi-jurisdictional utilities emissions are calculated differently than utilities whose service territory is entirely within the state of Oregon. We will discuss this later in the presentation. Asset controlling suppliers, or ACSs, are a specific type of electricity supplier that must be approved by the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. These types of entities own or operate interconnected electricity generating facilities or serve as an exclusive marketer for those facilities. Electric utilities that report purchasing power from an ACS report this power as a specified source, and the DEQ calculated system emission factor will be applied to that purchase for the purpose of emissions calculations. Currently, the only entities approved to be asset controlling suppliers with the Oregon Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program are the Bonneville Power Administration, or BPA, and Tacoma Power. Another reporting type are third-party reporters. These are entities that report on behalf of consumer-owned utilities, or COUs. Currently, only Bonneville Power Administration and PNGC Power have been designated by COUs as third-party reporters. Note that BPA is approved through DEQ as both an asset controlling supplier and separately as a third-party reporter. The report provided by a third party must contain all information as required by Division 215 for electricity suppliers. BPA does provide DEQ data on all their preference power sales, regardless of whether they were designated a third-party reporter. However, not all COUs who receive power from BPA are eligible to designate them as a third party to report on their behalf. Utilities must only receive electricity from BPA and must serve load exclusively in Oregon. If a COU is multi-jurisdictional or purchases power from any other source, BPA may not be designated as that COU's third-party reporter, and that COU must report directly to DEQ. Next, let's discuss when verification applies for electricity suppliers. Third-party verification applies to a regulated entity that submits an emissions data report as described in the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Rules that indicates emissions equaled or exceeded 25,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent in the previous reporting year, excluding CO2 from biomass-derived fuels. Every investor-owned utility, as well as every electricity service supplier, is subject to verification regardless of whether they met the 25,000 megatons CO2 equivalent threshold. This is in response to new regulation passed under House Bill 2021. Third-party reporters have special considerations under third-party verification applicability. As a third-party reporter, BPA is exempt from verification. However, other third-party reporters, as PNGC is currently the only other one, need to verify only if an individual COU on which they are reporting on behalf exceeds the 25,000 megatons CO2 equivalent threshold, excluding CO2 from biomass-derived fuels and excluding emissions associated with preference power purchased from BPA. Although only anthropogenic emissions are used to calculate the threshold for the applicability of third-party verification, all reported data from an emissions report are subject to verification once that threshold is met. This includes both anthropogenic and biogenic emissions. The elements comprising an emissions calculation are subject to verification, including megawatt hours delivered to end users in Oregon and the source from which it was generated or purchased. For multi-jurisdictional utilities, the megawatt hours delivered to the entire service territory, both within and without Oregon, are subject to verification. For asset controlling suppliers, the megawatt hours from the interconnected electricity generating facilities that are owned, operated, or in possession of exclusive rights to claim electricity by an ACS are subject to verification. Also, whether or not the amount of power being reported includes transmission losses is subject to verification. From these reported data elements, DEQ calculates a reporting entity's annual emissions. Some electricity suppliers that are subject to the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program rules and are required to submit emissions reports are not subject to the third-party verification program requirements. An emissions data report of less than 25,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent, excluding CO2 from biomass, are not subject to verification. An emissions data report from BPA, acting as a third-party reporter, is not subject to verification. And BPA preference power sales from consumer-owned utilities reported by a third party are exempt when determining threshold applicability. However, if a COU reports directly to DEQ, BPA preference power sales are not exempt from 3PV applicability threshold determinations. Once the threshold is met, all power transactions resulting in biogenic or anthropogenic emissions, including ones that were exempt from the threshold calculation, such as the BPA preference power sales, are subject to verification. Recall that BPA reports to DEQ as both a third-party reporter and an asset controlling supplier. While BPA is exempt from third-party verification as a third-party reporter, they are subject to verification as an asset controlling supplier. However, if an asset controlling supplier is verified under the California Air Resources Board, which BPA is, that ACS may submit the same verification statement submitted to CARB's mandatory reporting of greenhouse gas emissions programs if the data and the information verified under CARB are the same. Our next topic will be data that is reported to DEQ by electricity suppliers. The Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program began collecting data from electricity suppliers in 2010. Amendments to Oregon administrative rules affected how and what data was collected in 2015 and 2020. Also in 2020, the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program began collecting data via an online platform called Your DEQ Online. Prior to that time, reports were submitted via Excel workbooks. Power transactions are reported as either coming from a specified source or an unspecified source. Specified source transactions can be generated from a utility's own resources or purchased through a power contract. Regardless, it must be a single facility or unit designated in the power contract at the time a transaction occurs. A source may not be specified after a transaction occurs. An asset controlling supplier approved by DEQ is also considered a specified source. Although an ACS is supplying electricity from a fleet of generating sources, DEQ signs the ACS as system emission factor to account for power from this fleet. A generating facility that is owned or operated by a reporting entity is also considered a specified source. Unspecified sources are defined as power that was not designated for delivery from a specified source at the time of entry into a transaction. Energy imbalance markets or other centralized market purchases are also considered unspecified purchases, but they must be identified from other unspecified purchases by the reporting utility. Now we will take a closer look at when power can be claimed as generated from a specified source. Power is reported as generated when the reporting entity is 1. A full or partial owner or operator of the generating facility or unit, 2. Party to a power contract for a fixed percentage of generation from the facility or unit, or 3. Party to a tolling agreement and rents a facility or unit from the owner, or is an exclusive power deliverer that is not a retail provider and that has prevailing rights to claim electricity from the specified source. Moving on from generated power to specified power purchases, A utility can only report power as a specified purchase when they can provide documentation that a power contract designated purchases from a specific generating power facility, unit, or DEQ approved asset controlling supplier at the time the transaction was executed. Whether specified power was purchased or generated, when reporting this transaction to DEQ, the reporting entity needs to report the megawatt hours of power disaggregated by specified source, as measured at the busbar. Multi-jurisdictional and ACS entities report the power for their entire system. All other entities report power delivered to end users in Oregon. Utilities must use a 2% transmission loss correction factor when reporting electricity not measured at the busbar of the generating facility. To determine emissions from these power transactions, DEQ calculates and assigns an emission factor for each reported specified source, which is then applied to the megawatt hours reported. DEQ calculates and assigns emission factors for all sources from which an electricity supplier is reporting power as purchased or generated for the emissions year. The equation on this slide shows how this calculation is performed. For a given source, the facility-specific emission factor is found by dividing the annual GHG emissions in megatons of CO2 equivalent by the annual net generation in megawatt hours. DEQ's primary data sources for the development of 2023 emission factors are 2022 data from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, reported through the EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, 40 CFR Part 98, U.S. Energy Information Administration Forms 923 and 860. And when those data sets were unavailable for a specified source, DEQ uses alternative methods such as the fleet median based on a fuel type. DEQ's annual specified source emission factors are published on our GHG reporting program's Resources and Forms website under the Electricity Suppliers section. Updates occur throughout the reporting season, but the final documentation should be posted by the reporting deadline. Reporting entities may propose alternative emission factors that DEQ reviews and approves or rejects. They must provide supporting documentation on how alternative emission factors were derived. Putting together reported data from the DEQ assigned emission factor, we calculate emissions by each specified source, using the equation as displayed. We multiplied the megawatt hours served to end users in Oregon by the DEQ assigned facility or unit specific emission factor, and by transmission loss factor, where applicable. Now that we have covered the reporting requirements and how emissions are covered for specified power transactions, let's talk about unspecified power transactions. As a reminder, an unspecified source of electricity is a source of electricity that is not specified at the time of entry into the transaction to procure the electricity. Similar to specified source transactions, utilities must report the megawatt hours provided to end users in Oregon from any unspecified power source. However, different from specified sources, since the source of power is not known, the transaction receives a default emission factor of 0.428 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour. Electricity imported, sold, allocated, or distributed to end users in this state through an energy imbalance market or other centralized market administered by a market operator is considered to be an unspecified source. Although megawatt hours for power purchased from these markets must be separately reported from other unspecified sources, power transactions from a centralized market still receive the 0.428 default emission factor. Here's how emissions from unspecified sources are calculated. It is similar to the specified source calculation, except instead of a DEQ assigned facility-specific emission factor, a default emission factor is applied. Emissions from unspecified sources are calculated by multiplying the megawatt hours served to end users in Oregon by the default emission factor for unspecified power and by transmission loss factor where applicable. As mentioned before, multi-jurisdictional and ACS entities report the power for their entire system, both within and outside of Oregon. Multi-jurisdictional utilities have the option of reporting this power in accordance with a cost allocation methodology approved by the Oregon Public Utility Commission. All other entities only report power delivered to end users in Oregon regardless of where it was generated. Multi-jurisdictional utilities also separately report wholesale power sales from specified sources and retail sales to Oregon's portion of the utility services territory or power system. With these data elements and the DEQ assigned emission factors, a system emission factor for the multi-jurisdictional utility is determined. DEQ calculates an asset controlling supplier system emission factor using the equation shown on this slide by dividing the sum total of emissions in megatons CO2 equivalent by the sum of the total system net generation in megawatt hours for electricity service both within and outside of Oregon. For multi-jurisdictional utilities, emissions and energy from wholesale power sales are subtracted from their Oregon totals prior to being used to determine the system emission factor. The equations shown on this slide show how this is done. Then, by dividing the Oregon emissions in megatons of CO2 equivalent by Oregon delivered power in megawatt hours, the system emission factor is found. To calculate total emissions from a multi-jurisdictional entity, the DEQ calculated system emission factor is applied to the megawatt hours delivered to end users in Oregon, including transmission losses. Asset controlling suppliers must annually submit an application for DEQ to designate them as such. The application and supporting documentation are due on June 1st of each year. Documentation must provide all data for DEQ to calculate and assign the system emission factor. This includes information on how power was generated at facilities owned by the asset controlling supplier, wholesale electricity purchased and taken from specified sources, purchases from unspecified sources, and sales from specified sources. If the ACS submitted an application to CARB, and the information in the application is the same as what is requested by the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, the ACS may submit the CARB application to DEQ. DEQ annually publishes approved ACS emission factors for use by electricity suppliers reporting greenhouse gas emissions from specified sources. To accommodate reporting and verification requirements, the published ACS emission factor is based on data reported 2 years prior. That is, an emission factor reported by an ACS for emissions data year 2021 would be available for use in reporting year 2023. An ACS may submit their California Air Resources Board ACS verification statement in place of an Oregon-specific verification statement if the verified emissions data report includes the same data and information submitted to DEQ. Let's discuss our next topic, Your DEQ Online, DEQ's online platform for report submission. This is what the Your DEQ Online login portal looks like. In addition to basic information about the company and reporting contacts, reporting entities enter in the following information into Your DEQ Online. Electricity generating sources from which power was purchased, generated, or sold. Unspecified sources, including the energy imbalance market from which power was purchased. Megawatt hours delivered to end users in Oregon, and whether or not the power was measured at the busbar. There is some additional specific information required to be submitted through Your DEQ Online for different reporting types. Multi-jurisdictional entities report wholesale sales, generation, and purchases across the entire service territory, and ACSs report wholesale sales, generation, and purchases for the entire fleet of electricity generating facilities owned or operated by the ACS. However, Your DEQ Online is not designed to accept ACS applications through the form interface. This information is supplied as an Excel attachment in Your DEQ Online. Reported ACS data will be separate from other reported data when extracted from the system. Here is a list of potential documents that may be attached to a Your DEQ Online report submittal, depending on the reporting type of the entity. SF6 calculations, which are only a mandatory requirement for IOUs reporting emissions, ACS application and documentation for the ACS system emission factor calculation, any additional voluntary reporting documentation, for example, proposed alternative emission factors for a specific electricity generating facility, and BPA preference power sales for all COUs to whom they sell preference power, not just the COUs for which they have been designated to report on behalf of. This is what a basic forms field looks like in the Your DEQ Online platform. You can see where the reporting entity would select the source of electricity, indicate the transaction was for generated, specified, or unspecified purchases, enter the megawatt hours delivered, and indicate whether or not the power was measured at the bus bar. You can also see the field for the DEQ assigned source-specific emission factor. At the top, you can see the calculated anthropogenic emissions from this transaction. From this user-inputted data, your DEQ Online calculates emissions. Ahead of each reporting year, the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program calculates and assigns emission factors to all electricity generating sources for the reporting year and inputs them into YDO for reporting. Emissions are then calculated for each specified electricity generating source, and unspecified electricity receives a default emission factor. Utility-specific emission factors are also calculated within the system. You can see an example summary of the compiled data in this screenshot from the Your DEQ Online system. Utilities are able to download and provide verifiers with a PDF from YDO compiling their submitted data. We've highlighted what the utility manually enters for each resource to which the DEQ calculated emission factor and transmission loss factors are applied. A good rule of thumb for checking these entries is that purchased power is generally not measured at the bus bar, while generated power is. If an entry diverges from this rule of thumb, a closer look is needed to determine if it was chosen correctly. Moving on to our last topic before we get into some example exercises, the key verifying documents and materials that can be used for verifying data reported to the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. Data submitted through Your DEQ Online, including attachments to the submittal, are used as primary pieces for verification. Reporting entities are also able to enter comments into the reporting form, and those can be used to explain known issues. The other key verifying documents are power contracts and purchase agreements. These documents should identify whether a power transaction accounts for transmission losses and if they are from a specified source. A power contract may include associated verbal or electronic records when it is included as part of a written contract. Note that the reporting entities may aggregate multiple power transactions by specific sources and report it as one transaction in Your DEQ Online, which is permissible and encouraged. However, each transaction needs to be verified separately to ensure that the source is specified at the time the transaction occurs and denotes whether or not the transmission loss factor was accounted for. The burden of proof is on the reporting entity to justify the use of a 1.0 transmission loss factor. Site visits are another approach used for verifying the accuracy of reported data. Operation and ownership documents can verify power claimed as generated. When an asset controlling supplier is verified, their application material is subject to verification, although as previously stated, a CARB verification statement may suffice if the data is reported the same. Lastly, some reporting entities may propose alternative emission factors than the one DEQ calculates and assigns for a given specified source. The documentation that they provide DEQ to provide an alternative emission factor is subject to verification. From our first few years of verification, here are some common reporting errors that we see. Reporters may aggregate multiple power transactions by source in YDO, but each transaction needs to be verified. The correct source needs to be reported. Some sources have similar names, and reporting entities may confuse them when selecting them from the dropdown in YDO. Verifying elements include the primary fuel type, the address, or the EPA or EIA ID. A common error in past years has been inaccurate designation of whether power was measured at the bus bar or not. House Bill 2021 allows for the exclusion of qualified facilities and net metering. Starting in 2023, these are broken out and their net metering and qualified facility status must be verified. The Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program also reviews data submitted to DEQ by electricity suppliers for any potential inaccuracies on an annual basis, 3 to 6 months following the reporting deadline. We review all reporting entities regardless of whether they are subject to third-party verification or not, and look for any significant increase or decrease in megawatt hours or emissions by source, and we also compare data to publicly available reported emissions and power data for inconsistencies. The review is conducted outside of the ORDEQ Online system, and we ask questions and clarifications directly to the reporting entity and save our findings on our shared drive. If revisions to data are required, this is performed within ORDEQ Online and must be made within 45 days upon discovery. The original report is archived and retained for ORDEQ Online purposes. This will also be reported to the verifier for any re-verification needs. Once all corrections to data have been satisfactorily made, data is published at the utility level on the GHG reporting program website. Now for the last topic of the training, we will do a run-through of a few exercises to provide examples of the greenhouse gas reporting program rules in action. In this first exercise, we will run through an emissions calculation for a non-multi-jurisdictional investor-owned utility. In this example, the utility reports the following power transactions for electricity delivered to Oregon end users. 12,000 megawatt hours from BPA, read at the bus bar. 15,000 megawatt hours from energy imbalance market purchases, not read at the bus bar. BPA is an approved ACS with DEQ, and so an anthropogenic emission factor of 0.017 megatons of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour and biogenic emission factor of 0 megaton CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour have been calculated and assigned based on their system mix. For this exercise, we are asking you to calculate the anthropogenic and biogenic emissions delivered to Oregon end users by this utility. If desired, you can pause the training here to work on the exercise and resume the training when you are ready to see the answer. In this example case, BPA is an approved ACS with DEQ and has an ACS anthropogenic emission factor of 0.017 megatons of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour and a biogenic emission factor of 0 megatons of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour. For BPA, we take the megawatt hours purchased, in this case 12,000, and multiply it by its DEQ approved system emission factor and the transmission loss factor, which in this case is 1 because the power reading was done at the bus bar. The total emissions from this power transaction come out to be 204 megatons of CO2 equivalent. The purchase of energy from the energy imbalance market is considered to be unspecified power purchases, and thus receives the default emission factor of 0.428 megatons of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour and biogenic emission factor of 0 megatons of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour. The EIM transaction did not include transmission losses, so a 1.02 transmission loss factor was also applied. This gives anthropogenic emissions of 6,548 megaton CO2 equivalent. When we sum the emissions together from all reported transactions, anthropogenic emissions total to 6,752 megatons of CO2 equivalent and biogenic emissions of 0 megatons of CO2 equivalent. In this exercise, we will cover emission calculations for a multi-jurisdictional utility. In this example, a multi-jurisdictional entity reports the following purchases across their system. 25,000 megawatt hours purchased from Carty, read at the bus bar. 55,000 megawatt hours from Biomass 1, not read at the bus bar. 20,000 megawatt hours of unspecified purchases, not read at the bus bar. And 10,000 megawatt hours of wholesale sales from Tiber Dam, read at the bus bar. They also report that 10,000 megawatt hours were delivered to Oregon end users. DEQ assigns the following facility-specific emission factors. Carty has an anthropogenic emission factor of 0.397 megatons of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour and a biogenic emission factor of 0 megatons of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour. Biomass 1 has an anthropogenic emission factor of 0.022 megatons of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour and a biogenic emission factor of 1.651 megatons of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour. Tiber Dam has an anthropogenic emission factor of 0 megatons of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour and a biogenic emission factor of 0 megatons of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour. For this exercise, we are asking you to calculate the anthropogenic and biogenic emissions delivered to Oregon end users by this utility. If desired, you could pause the training here to work on the exercise and resume the training when you are ready to see the answer. When rounding to the nearest whole number, The final result is 2,210 megatons of CO2 equivalent anthropogenic emissions and 10,290 megatons CO2 equivalent of biogenic emissions. Let's walk through how we got there. Recall that we have to determine a system emission factor for multi-jurisdictional utilities and then apply that emission factor to the megawatt hours of power delivered to Oregon end users. To determine the system emission factor, we first determine emissions by source across the service territory. For the CARDI source, we multiply the megawatt hours reported as purchased, in this case 25,000, by the DEQ assigned anthropogenic emission factor of 0.397, and then by 1 for the transmission loss factor since the power was read at the bus bar. Then we do the same using the biogenic emission factor, which for CARDI is 0. We use the same method for biomass 1, only note that the power was not measured at the bus bar, so we need to apply the 2% default transmission loss factor. Unspecified purchases receive the default emission factor of 0.428 megatons of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour. A transmission loss factor of 2% is also applied since the power was not read at the bus bar. Tiber Dam is a hydro generating station, and so has an anthropogenic and biogenic emission factor of 0, and therefore has no associated emissions. When we sum the anthropogenic and biogenic emissions separately across these sources, but subtract the emissions from Tiber Dam since it was reported as a wholesale sale. We also sum the total megawatt hours across the purchases, but subtract the megawatt hours from Tiber Dam. To determine the system emission factor, we take the total sum of the anthropogenic emissions divided by the total megawatt hours, and then do the same for the biogenic emissions. We get an anthropogenic emission factor of 0.221 megatons CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour and a biogenic system emission factor of 1.029 megatons of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour. We then multiply the emissions reported as served to Oregon end users, in this case 10,000 megawatt hours, by the anthropogenic system emission factor and separately the biogenic system emission factor to get the total emissions to be reported as resulting from electricity served to Oregon end users from this utility. Now let's try another exercise about determining verification applicability. In this exercise, PNGC Power reports to the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program on behalf of Consumers Power, a consumer-owned utility. For Consumers Power, PNGC Power reports emissions from the following power transactions. Purchase from Biomass 1, resulting in 21,000 megatons of CO2 equivalent anthropogenic emissions and 11,000 megatons of CO2 equivalent biogenic emissions. Purchase from BPA Preference Power, resulting in 5,000 megatons of CO2 equivalent anthropogenic emissions and 0 biogenic emissions. Does Consumer Power meet the threshold for verification applicability? If desired, you can pause the training here to work on the exercise and resume the training when you're ready to see the answer. The answer to this example is no. BPA Preference Power is exempt from the applicability threshold calculations. Therefore, only the 21,000 megatons of CO2 equivalent anthropogenic emissions from Biomass 1 are considered, which is below the 25,000 megatons of CO2 equivalent threshold. This concludes Course 3 of the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program Third-Party Verification Training. Thank you for attending today's training on the electricity sector. If you have any questions about this course, please email us at 3pverify@deq.oregon.gov.